Hello, this is Off Leash with Erik Prince. I'm Mark Serrano. With Donald Trump taking office, we are now focused on regional issues. You know, Erik, the media, of course, they focus on Israel, naturally. They focus on Ukraine. And of course, the media in America, they're so conflicted with the Democrats on their Ukraine policy. There's this tendency to forget about the threats that exist right in our own region. So as Donald Trump's taking office, I'd like to do sort of an overview of South America, of the region, and the threats that exist for us. And we've got a couple of countries we've got to really dive into for off-leash viewers. So first off, let's sort of take a view of the region, because there is this malign influence that's coming from socialists, from China, from Russia, and it's a tremendous threat. And I feel that we're on this we're teetering on this brink, and Donald Trump can make a tremendous difference to sort of topple some of these regimes. So give us the overview, and then we'll get into some specifics.
Okay. As you look at Latin America, it's a real study in contrast of governance philosophies. You had Jair Bolsonaro, who was the president of Brazil, ousted by a leftist in a very contested, probably a fraudulent election. You have Milei in Argentina, who's had an amazing turnaround story. That's probably the best, that's the good news story of all of Latin America, because of the very stiff Austrian economic libertarian reforms that he's pushed through, and he's taken them from a severe deficit, massive inflation, all the rest. He's cut massive amounts of government bureaucrats, and they're actually running a positive growth story economy for the first time in 20, 25 years. I think even running a budget surplus, small one. So, but the rest of the north of Latin America has really been really having problems. Bolivia, major cocaine problems, bad governance. Peru, left-wing government, significant problems. Chile, left-wing government, tried to push through some very left-wing reforms, pushed back. Venezuela, flat-out stolen election. They voted in socialism 25 years ago under Chavez in 1999. And it has been a slow fall into the abyss for them. And of course, they had an election last July, which was an election, right? And again, the Biden administration promised, okay, we're going to drop sanctions if you have an election. So the Maduro regime had an election, which they lost by more than 40 points, and they have completely ignored the results of the election. And Maduro just reinstalled himself with no legitimacy on January 10. That is a problem the Trump administration inherits, because if governments are allowed to completely ignore any kind of vote, and it's not even close, 40 points they lost. So Venezuela and the Maduro regime reinstalls itself with the help of Cuban communist security officers that have really embedded themselves all across the Venezuelan security apparatus, almost like Soviet commissars, the real ones that control each military unit and security unit. That is a huge problem. The money from there has been spilling all through the rest of Latin America, and even into Guatemala, Honduras, very left-wing government there. Nicaragua, of course, the Sandinistas are again in charge. Daniel Ortega, the same jackass that was supporting full-on communism in the 80s. Right. So you have a couple of spots of great light with a lot of darkness. El Salvador, what Bukele did 5 years ago, winning an election, and I think that was an act of true desperation. They said, okay, Bukele, do it. He won on a security platform, and he won, and he did. He locked up just under 2% of the population, 70,000 gangsters, the MS-13, because it was the most dangerous place in the Western Hemisphere in terms of the gang murders. And he locked it down, and and it's amazing. It's now safer in El Salvador than Prince William County. Okay, Prince William County, where the FBI crime lab is located, where Quantico is El Salvador is safer. So governance really matters, and so you can't let you have to have more El Salvadors and more Argentinas. Of course, Colombia is now, you went from a right-wing government that largely defeated the FARC to this guy Petro, who used to be a member of M19, which was the Communist Party of Colombia back in the 80s when they attacked and took a whole bunch of diplomats hostage in the foreign ministry in Bogota. They did that, and now the guy, one of those terrorists, is now the elected president of Colombia.
So, you talk about money flowing through the region, particularly from, like you said, Cuba to Venezuela.
Narco money, Cuban, I would say, organization and intelligence, and a lot of now Chinese money. Okay, they're investing in the region. It's soft money, soft power, gaining access to ports, huge port access in Peru, in Ecuador, and in Chile. They're there for the resources, and they're there to spread significant economic power.
But that's where this malign influence comes, in part. It's narco money, but it's also the Chinese making these investments in infrastructure and basically tying the hands of some of these leaders, with loans, with infrastructure loans and so forth, that ties them down forever and allows China to have their influence.
And it pays off the leaders, right? Because remember, in the foreign ministry, the basement of the foreign ministry in Beijing, there's a vault room where they take certain leaders, energy minister, foreign minister, whatever, and they take them to their assigned drawer, has their name on it, and it's full of gold, cash, diamonds, or whatever, and say, this is yours as long as you play ball with us while you're in office.
So let's just touch on Venezuela for a moment, because obviously there's some serious decision making coming, at Donald Trump in the very near future. Leading up to Maduro's inauguration, his swearing in, he briefly detained Machado, the opposition leader, who they blocked from the ballot, as you've instructed everybody here on Off Leash. And it was interesting because she was only detained briefly, but word spread fast because she's been in hiding for months. She came out to join a protest against his swearing in, and she was detained.
They took her right off a motorcycle.
Did it backfire very quickly. What's your read on it?
I understand I think they made her record some kind of video, but there were certain distress words indicated in that video, and then she was released. So I don't know if she was, if someone called and said, whoa, release her, we can't have that, or if they bought their way out of the situation. It could be either one. I don't know clearly, but she is a brave politician. Yeah. And the fact that she's staying there and staying in the fight and the struggle at great personal risk. Edmundo Gonzalez, the guy he was the face that won the free election, or the election that was stolen. The regime went so far as detained his son-in-law, arrested him, probably abusing him. So look, the regime is resorting to every kind of strong arm tactic. But I'm hopeful that Maria Corina will stay true to the purpose and see this through. What the Trump administration inherits is a mess. The only thing the Biden administration has done is raise the bounty on Maduro and Diosdado Cabello slightly. Senator Scott introduced a bill based on a tweet I did back in August that they should raise it to $100 million each because of, and they don't need to use U.S. tax dollars. They can use frozen Venezuelan government money that we're already sitting on. Look. There's a way to do this. I think it's going to be through covert action. I can't see, it's not going to be a case of sending the Marines to oust Maduro. Not necessary. He is not popular. He lost, but 70% of the people voted against him, and that includes most of the security forces. They are tired of the socialist nonsense and ready to make a change.
And Trump's going to have to look Chevron in the eye and say, sorry, fellas, but the fat times are over. We need to put tough sanctions back in and cut off the oil.
Yeah, Chevron, Harry Sargent, the rest, they're on the wrong side here, and it's probably time to name and shame their board members again, just because they are actually supporting a Marxist government that is oppressing their people.
Understood, but Joe Biden basically gave them the free pass to do it.
He did
as well,
Yep.
right? So
yeah, and that's the very corrupting influence of that kind of money on lobbyists in Washington.
Okay, let me touch real briefly also on Panama. Very, very interesting. You know, Donald Trump's not even in office. He talks about the Panama Canal. He talks about the U.S. being, charged outrageous rates to utilize the canal, that China's got their influence on the canal, and Donald Trump says, well, time for us to maybe take it back.
I understand it is within the rights of the United States for national security purposes to take over the administration of the canal. The problem is the Chinese have bought in to the port management and largely control both ends of it. So yes, there is a significant soft, which could become hard power Chinese capability in Panama. That is a major problem, because if we're going to have a problem in the Pacific with China, it means it's a naval fight, which means you have to be able to ship resources from the East Coast to the West Coast quickly. That means through the Panama Canal, so you don't have to drive all the way around the southern tip of Chile, to add an extra month onto the transit. So us having clear control and security of the Panama Canal is a national security priority. So, and Trump is right to finally call it out, to say, hey, we built that, we administered it. Jimmy Carter gave it away unwisely in the late 80s or in the late 70s. It's time for us to revisit that problem.
Well, which is, so we agree that something has to happen. It's just how Trump gets it done is the real challenge, right? And the big question mark around it. How do you accomplish that? Going to put some economic pressure on Panama, perhaps? Diplomatic pressure?
He has a wide range of options available to him.
That's a great response. Look, we got to talk about Ecuador. And there's an election coming up. And it's really interesting to me as I studied up on Ecuador, thanks to some research that you provided me. I realized, wow, what a strategic interest we have there, and some leadership change that could come that's thoroughly against our interest. So let's break it down. Tell us about the election that's coming up,
Sure.
And then we'll go into history.
So Ecuador, just south of Colombia, a country with significant reach, significant resources, a very wealthy country in the making. A huge fishery, I think the second largest tuna catch in the world. They own the Galapagos. Significant oil produced, and significant port access. So what happened is a guy named Daniel Noboa won an interim election, which was held. It was kind of a snap election because the previous president was going to be potentially impeached. So Noboa's in there for about a year. Now there's a general election called February 9. And what's happened is kind of like the rot that happened in Venezuela with Chavismo. This guy, Rafael Correa, was a super leftist. He took power in 2008 already and started taking the country in a very left-wing direction.
Through 2017.
Through 2017. He loaded up the country with $24 billion in Chinese debt, and really became beholden to them. He kicked out the U.S. from a significant base, which was used for counter-narcotics from Manta, which is a port up in the northwest of Ecuador. And he basically did all the wrong things, cozied up to the Russians, cozied up to the Chinese, cozied up to the Venezuelans. And now a complete surrogate for Rafael Correa, a woman named Luisa Gonzalez, who we think is even a mother to one of his children. Okay, she's running as the perfect surrogate.
Let's talk about pillow talk.
With the money and political organization of Correa. Of course, Correa had to run away from the country for corruption charges, and he's now hiding out in Belgium.
But he says a lot about our relationship with Belgium.
Exactly. Also problematic.
Right.
Yeah. So the amount of drugs that comes out of Ecuador that goes to Europe is highly significant. Right. All the coke that comes out of Colombia, Peru, out through Ecuador. So this is a huge problem if the leftist wins. because you have basically another pickup for the Socialist club
Right.
of Venezuela, Colombia, and then Ecuador, because you already have a left-wing government in Peru as well. And so the Trump administration, takes over January 20, February 9. The Biden administration has been completely asleep at the switch and not pushing back on this leftist narco-Chinese nexus of soft power, undermining American
And probably
interest.
a lot of propaganda around the election, I would assume.
Yes, sure. And sadly, Noboa's even had to deal with his own deep state because he takes over a year ago, and the holdovers from the Correa administration in the energy ministry, electricity ministry, so they've made major power shortages. They've had a massive gang revolt where they tried to take over the country a few days. So he's fighting multiple layers of leftist rot from outside influence and inside his country as well.
And it sounds like Noboa he's only been in office for a couple of years. So it sounds like.
Like 14 months.
Okay.
So it's tough.
He really hasn't had a chance to make some substantial change yet.
Not a chance. But I think if he wins, and we really hope he does, he will take the country, of the economic advice of Milei with the security advice of Bukele from El Salvador.
But this, let's talk about U.S. strategic interests there. And my understanding is it's being, on the equator, makes it the ideal position, by the way, for launching satellites.
Yes. Also a reason
what
for
else?
Chinese interest, right? Imagine their ability to launch spacecraft from within our own hemisphere.
Right.
So again, the Chinese under the previous administration, put a huge SIGINT facility in southern Argentina. They have a huge facility in Cuba. They have a facility in Venezuela. And I'm sure they'd love to put their hooks in to Ecuador in the same way. They've already loaded them up with $24 billion in debt due to their patsy, Rafael Correa, who's now trying to get his baby mama elected president of Ecuador now.
Why is nobody talking about this infrastructure presence by the Chinese? And I'm not even talking about the infrastructure investments they've made in some of these countries to sort of handcuff them. But I mean, you're talking about military infrastructure of the Chinese in various locations.
Because a commercial port can become a military port that fast, right?
Right.
You can have lots of containers loaded, and as soon as you open them up, there comes your military gear. So it is a significant security problem, but you've had very unserious people in the Biden administration completely asleep at the switch.
Now, this may be a way that our incoming Secretary of State can have some serious influence, because he's very focused in Marco Rubio on Latin America and on China. I mean, he's always been a real, fighter against China. So maybe Marco Rubio can make a difference there, because that really is scary.
When he takes office, that should be his 3-meter target, is the election in Ecuador, because this Gonzalez cannot win. She will take Ecuador further down the path of Venezuela, corruption, a loss of democracy, and poverty and narco trafficking for the people.
So the fact that Noboa was able to get in the office in the first place is encouraging, but this election is a very, very big deal.
Because this is for a full 4-year term.
And by the way, their location is pretty fascinating to me for shipping, as you were saying.
For shipping, for the fishery. So a side note, the Chinese loot the entire west coast of South America. So the largest per capita consumer of seafood in the world is China. And they actually send a converted VLCC, a 250,000 ton vessel, which is half oiler, half converted to a freezer ship. It's basically a floating base. They moor it off the Galapagos. That supports their Chinese maritime militia of 340 some fishing boats, which go all the way from Colombian waters, Ecuador, all the way to Chile, down to the Drake Passage at the south. Mm-hmm. Okay, looting fish, collecting it out of the fishery of those countries without paying any of the license fees or the tolls, etc. And they take it back to that big mothership, and as soon as the mothership is full, they drive it back to China, full of looted fish. So again, lots of problems to be solved of malign Chinese influence in our hemisphere, Trump administration has his work to do
And there's
from day one.
There got to be a lot of bad actors who are putting their thumb on the scale for this election. I mean, even Maduro, what kind of influence do you suppose he's trying to have on the Ecuadorian election on February 9th?
I'm sure plenty of money and a lot of the same nonsense that that they use to try to steal their election. They will try to steal it for Gonzalez.
So, what Donald Trump will have 2 weeks before that election. Is there anything he can do as soon as he takes office?
Well, he's a very popular guy in Latin America.
So, at a minimum,
So he
can
needs to
start
be
talking
he
about
needs
it.
to be sounding off on it. Yep.
Right.
As does Marco Rubio.
Yeah. Last topic on Latin America, Brazil. I mean, it's got vast resources, and what it's also got this horrendous shift left.
Yep.
In fact, Bolsonaro was invited to the Trump inauguration, and they're blocking him from being able to attend. What's your outlook for Brazil? What can we do there from a policy standpoint?
Governance matters, and countries that reinforce the rule of law, private property, actual commerce instead of crony capitalism, which is what the left kind of pushes for throughout Latin America. It's a very clear shift. What Milei is doing in Argentina is a bright shining light of what good governance and limited government is supposed to look like. Brazil, you're right, has enormous resources, hardworking population. It has look, if you fly on a commercial aircraft in America, it's either a Boeing, an Airbus, or an Embraer. An Embraer made in Brazil, okay? There's a lot of Germans and Italians showed up in Brazil after the 1940s, and actually before, okay? They have a no-kidding industry, an industrial base, and if that country is nurtured with good governance, those kind of pieces of the economy and their agribusiness will continue to grow enormously, and they should.
I almost forgot. In his last gasp in office, Joe Biden just lifted sanctions on Cuba. We got to touch on that as well.
Another insult to every freedom-loving person. Now, they said, well, Cuba is no longer a state sponsor of terrorism because they're releasing some people from political prison.
Right.
So it's kind of
absurdity of it.
It's reinforcing the Putin model of grabbing people almost as hostages to get yourself off of certain sanctions list. I really hope the Trump administration puts those restrictions right back in place.
It's hard to figure out what lunatics, how they think. But what was the thought process? Who are they appealing to? Are they just trying to make things more difficult for Donald Trump?
To me, it's almost like taking the Houthis off the terror list, right? That was one of the first acts the Biden administration started with. And what are the Houthis doing now? They're shooting thousands of missiles and drones at our ships, shutting off a major seaway. It's more of the same. It's unserious people making decisions they are not qualified to make.
So Obama started this.
Yes.
And now Joe Biden, in one of his last acts in office, which just blows my mind,
Yep.
is literally saying, okay, Cubans, we love Cuba, right? And we're going to bond with them.
We like Cubans, but we don't like the Cuban government.
Yeah.
Nor do the people like their government.
And by the way, the Cuban Americans in Florida, in Miami, they love Donald Trump. And I can imagine their reaction to this action by Joe Biden.
So there's 10 million Cubans in Cuba. There's 2.5 million Cubans in the United States. The 2.5 million Cubans in the United States generate 10 times the GDP of the Cubans remaining in Cuba. So it's pretty clear governance does matter. If you give smart, hardworking people the rule of law and capitalism structures to work under, they can do well. And the revolutionary communist nonsense of the Cuban government has destroyed the country, impoverished the people, and enough.
Yeah. Well, and this could be an early win, again, for Marco Rubio, because he's very savvy on Cuban issues. He can get this reversed very, very quickly.
So, again, Trump administration, if you're listening, Ecuador, that's the 3-meter target.
Yeah.
Do that first.
And they've got 2 weeks before that election.
Yep.
Absolutely. Look, this has been another amazing tour of the Western Hemisphere of Latin America by Erik. You're only going to get this kind of information on Off Leash. Stay tuned with us for every episode. Don't forget to check out our sponsor, unplugged.com/off-leash is where you go to get your unplugged phone today. As for now, this is Off Leash with Erik Prince. I'm Mark Serrano. Until next time.